everybody. Welcome again to Intro to Philosophy. Today we are going to continue our discussion about free will and determinism. Last class we talked about Blatchford and his presentation of the view of determinism. Determinism are determinists are people who deny that free will is real. They think that all of our actions are even if we feel free, they think all of our actions are really determined by subconscious factors beyond our control. Remember, Blatchford thought that those subconscious factors were factors in, like scientific factors in our heredity and in our environment, right? So genetic factors and environmental factors and how you were brought up, how you have been taught to behave, and so on, right? So we talked about determinism. We're going to talk today about the other side. The other side is what I have called metaphysical libertarianism. Look in your notes from yesterday. You wrote down metaphysical libertarianism and gave a brief definition. Well, what we're going to hear from today is Charles Campbell, and he is going to defend libertarianism against Blatchford's attack. You might have noticed that Campbell is a little harder to read. Campbell suffers from a very serious condition that we call philosopheritis. When you're in the throes of philosopheritis, you can never say in 5 words what you could if you could instead say it in 25 words, right? He's, in other words, very long-winded, right? And he talks with this very kind of puffed up air, as though what he's saying is very, very important, right? I only hate on him for that reason, because he's a 20th century writer. That writing style has been going out of style for a long time in philosophy, and so he's very late in the game to be writing in such a puffed up, sort of pretentious style. So, but hopefully you got through it. So, because there's some good stuff there, and a big part of the problem with his style is that he has some interesting things to say. Those interesting things aren't that terribly complicated, but it's his style that makes them really hard to understand. So we're going to break that down today. So, okay, Campbell starts here. It says that he wants to frame the free will and determinism debate in his own way first. And he does this by saying that, well, we should forget about talk about frivolous things. That the important issue in the free will and determinism debate are not these superficial or frivolous choices that we make from moment to moment and why we make those. The real question has to do with the kinds of actions that require deliberation and for which there is moral responsibility attached. Okay, so one of the examples I gave yesterday was my friend Jen choosing fingernail polish, right? Now, most people in the free will and determinism debate, say that's probably a pretty good story and then, raises some good questions. I think Campbell is a person who, though, is going to be very sort of patient with those kinds of very unimportant choices. He thinks that the really interesting choices are the kinds of choices for which we assign moral praise or moral blame. Right? So what he wants to do is he wants to start there and think about that. He wants to think that, and he wants to think about, well, what would freedom be? What kind of freedom would leave us with moral responsibility? So let's just speculate for a second. If free will existed, and it was the kind of free will that left us with moral responsibility, what would it be like? I made some notes. And Campbell says it would have a few features. So, what kind of freedom would leave us with moral responsibility? Is it light enough in here? We need more light.
No, I think it's good.
In the first case, he said it would be a manner of inner acts, not just behavior. We're not just talking about a person's behavior. We're talking about the little internal decision making that's going on inside of you that precedes your behavior, right? you have to have criminal intentions to perform a criminal act. Somebody who does something bad but does it without criminal intentions is under the law not guilty of the crime, right? And that there's something like that Campbell is getting at here. He thinks that first and foremost, what we're talking about when we're talking about whether or not free will exists is whether or not our intentions exist. Good intentions versus bad intentions exist, and whether or not we are free to have good intentions and bad intentions. Secondly, sole authorship is required. You have to be able to say that I alone to determine the act if you are going to be held morally responsible for it, right? We must be able to say I could have acted otherwise because I could have chosen otherwise. That for everything that we do, we have to be able to say that I could have done otherwise. And we have to be able to say that not because the universe could have been different or I could have been raised with different parents, but we have to be able to say I could have acted otherwise because in that moment I could have made a different choice. Right? Now, so having laid out what good old-fashioned free will would look like, now it's a reasonable question to ask, well, why in the world would anybody believe in that? Right? And the important word, the word that should always come to mind whenever we're talking about libertarians and their evidence, that word is underlined here, intuition, right? The metaphysical libertarians are always going to use as their evidence this intuition that we all have, moment to moment, this immediate knowledge that we all have from moment to moment, that for any action that we do, we are free to do it, and if we did it, well, we could have acted otherwise, right? Determinists thought that kind of intuition was pretty worthless, unscientific, maybe superstitious. It's going to be front and center, though, for the libertarians. They think we have to take it seriously, and Campbell is going to make the case that we can't really make sense of ourselves or our behavior or the behavior of others without assuming this basic structure, without assuming that people choose their actions from alternatives and they're morally responsible for those actions and that they could have acted otherwise, right? So intuition tells us then that we choose our actions from alternatives. We are morally responsible for those actions. I ran out of room here at the bottom, but what it says is, when faced with temptation, we can put forth moral effort, and this is going to be an important issue. In fact, Campbell's idea of moral effort is going to be the centerpiece of his argument, right? So, first of all, to unpack that a little bit, in the face of temptation, Campbell assumes that we all have certain kinds of moral knowledge. We all know right from wrong. We are all tempted to do, at times, things other than the good, right? Now, when this happens, we have this ability to talk ourselves out of doing the bad thing. We want to do it. We really, really want to do it, but no, we're not going to do it. And Campbell thinks this is an example of us putting forth, he calls this talking ourselves out of it, he calls this moral effort. And he thinks that moral effort is going to be the real battleground over the question of free will versus determinism. So pause for a second. So as I said before, the real fight here is going to be over Campbell's concept of moral effort, which we're going to get to in a second. But I want to say a little more, make a more preliminary comment on what's about to happen next. Campbell realizes that, so Campbell, by the time he's writing this in the mid part of the 20th century, he's a dying breed. Determinism is going out of style in the way that, in a way very similar to how dualism went out of style, and along the same timeline, maybe a relationship there. Dualism and determinism are both facing a real crisis by the middle part of the 20th century. And so he's he's sort of a man under siege, right? He's sort of the last man on the hill, screaming for everybody to be reasonable. He realizes the problem. He realizes the problem he's up against, and the problem, of course, is that all of the data, the hard scientific data from neuroscience and psychology, doesn't give a whole lot of support to libertarianism, right? The libertarian is not going to get taken very seriously at a conference on cognitive science, right? I may have told you the story before, but it bears repeating. If you bring up free will or dualism or the mind-body problem or any of these things to a neuroscientist, the neuroscientist will laugh in your face. I know this. I've had this very face has been laughed in by a neuroscientist I ran into at a party once when we started talking about the mind-body problem. Anyway, those same problems are happening for these long-term scientific health of determinism. Determinism seems to be going the way of the dodo, because the more we understand about neuroscience, the more we understand about how the brain brings about our actions, the more it seems like, well, believing in free will is just superstition, right? So Campbell has to give us a push. And he has to give us a defense of libertarianism, he realizes. He has to give us a defense of libertarianism that still allows for factors like heredity and environment to play a role in decision-making. We all know that they play some role. So it would be a total non-starter for the libertarian to say, oh, well, yeah, I'm just free. My heredity and my environment don't affect me at all in the person I am. There's just too much. The mountain of evidence to the contrary on that is just too large. I mean, we talked about last time. If a child is raised in an abusive home with alcoholic parents who are car thieves and drug dealers, chances are the kid is going to grow up to have a very rough life and probably engage in most of the same activities as parents engaged in, right? This is not magic. It's not. It's also not rocket science, right? It's that we tend to be products of our environment, and given that child's heredity, given that child's moral environment that he was raised in, 2 + 2 tends to equal 4. Now, we cite other examples, and we might talk about this later, of cases where, 2 kids raised in exactly the same home, one goes on to be a college professor, the greatest thing you can be in life, and one goes on to be, a murderer or a car thief, right? How does the determinist account for that? Or how does either side, the determinist or the libertarian, account for that? We'll maybe come back and talk about that a little bit later. It'll be your job to remind me about that. Okay. My lovely assistant, Beth, it will be her job to ask that question at the end of the lecture. Yeah, well, what about the kids raised in the same home who end up going down 2 different paths? Okay. But for now, we are going to talk about moral effort. Moral effort is Campbell never comes right out and defines it, but here you go, no extra charge. Moral effort is the amount of psychological resistance we can summon in the face of temptation, to resist temptation. You might say psychological resistance. You might say spiritual resistance even. Campbell is a Christian, so he's okay with a moment of praying to God or whatever, right? But there is some amount of spiritual, psychological resistance, some amount of talking yourself out of doing something bad that it will take to be able to talk you out of that bad thing, right? And when we don't, we've given in to temptation. When we do talk ourselves out of temptation, well, then we say, okay, well, I should have done, hey, I was really, really wanting that, but I decided not to, right? So To explain how this is all going to work, it's time for some of my famously bad art. So, we have 2 students. Normally, I will let my class name them. I guess I will have to name them. So I will name them. I don't know. What do you want to name them, babe?
Fred and George.
Fred and George. Okay, so here's Fred, here's George. Fred and George they are both their first week of school. You know, imagine the COVID crisis passes, people are able to be in the same room again. The dorms and college campus is open. Everybody's excited to be back at school. Fred and George are both freshmen at a very nice, prestigious university, right? And their first week, this shouldn't happen, we all know, but their very first week at college, they find themselves at a party where there is a giant, delicious keg of beer, right?
Thought it was going to be a stack of pancakes.
No. Okay. So Fred and George are at this party. They have there's a giant keg of beer. Some say it looks like a stack of pancakes. No, it's a keg of beer, and it's delicious beer. This is an important part. This isn't some weak AB product. This is real great, delicious beer. This is the kind of beer that you could just drink all night and one more, right? So notice now in Fred and George's hands, they each have a big red cup. It's black and white, so you can't see the color, but it's a big red cup in one hand, and in their other hand, they have car keys. Right.
Red pens.
No. Yes. Okay. I do have. I've been informed.
Sorry, I'm heckling.
What was that? Oh, I've been informed that we do have red markers, so I could make the big red cups red, but nobody's got time for that. So anyway, Fred and George both find themselves facing a moral dilemma. After that, let's say that magical second or third beer, knowing that they are going to have to drive themselves home back to their apartments. They have to make the moral decision to tap the brakes, maybe have a glass of water or something, wait a while until they are feeling well enough to drive the car home without there being any major problems, right? Now let's lay some wagers here on what Fred is going to do and what George is going to do. But first, let's handicap it. Let's talk a little bit about what they're like, what's going on in their lives. So Fred is super pumped to be here at school. He is very, very happy. He couldn't be more excited. He's always been a really good student. He's always had lots of support from his parents. He has never had a drink. I mean, once in a while, taste a beer at a family party or something like that. But beer, drinking has never really been his thing. His parents never had a bad relationship with alcohol. They were always nothing but supportive. He's pumped, super happy to be here, right? Now let's talk about George. Man, George has got problems. You can tell by his hair is kind of tousled, right? Look, he's got a little bedhead. Well, George is he's got some problems. So he was raised by parents who struggled with alcoholism their whole lives. There were various periods of neglect and abuse in his life. He always had a good mind, though, with the help of an inspiring teacher. He got really good grades in high school, despite beginning to develop some substance abuse problems himself. Right, he was starting to drink too much his sophomore year, but his teacher helped him turn around, and he ended up getting into a really great school. Of course, 2 weeks before he left for school, his girlfriend broke up with him. Right, that's a tradition at the end of August, and so he's heartbroken. Right, so Fred and George are both at the party. Right, they both are having a few glasses of delicious beer. Who do we think is going to do the right thing and go home and not wreck his car? And who do we think is going to do the dangerous thing and risk running his car into a school bus on his way home? Here's where moral effort comes in. And Campbell thinks that both of these people are going to be experiencing temptation. And in the face of temptation, they are both, in a way, at the most basic level, they are both equally capable of putting forth moral effort to resist that temptation. Now, the difference is, the difference between their moral effort, the moral effort it takes them to resist, is going to have to do with factors like heredity and environment. Fred, the first guy, right, who had all of the advantages in life and was never really a drinker and always had supportive parents, it's not going to take him a lot of moral effort to do the right thing. Nonetheless, that is delicious beer, so it takes him a little bit. Let's say it takes him 5 points of moral effort. George, on the other hand, George has got problems, right? Because of his heredity and his environment, it's going to take him a lot more moral effort to get to make the right choice. Let's say it takes him 50 points of moral effort. Now, what do we take away from this? Well, on one level, Campbell's admitting that life is not fair, right? All of us walk around with different levels of moral effort that it takes us to resist certain temptations. We all have our poison. Maybe you're not much of a drinker, but maybe you're a gambler, right? Or maybe you're a smoker. Or maybe there's some other thing that you know is bad, it's bad for you, but you must have it. Or the only way to not have it is to really work with yourself and really work hard to avoid putting yourself in a position of being exposed to that temptation, right? That Campbell is perfectly willing to admit is the result of things like heredity and environment, like your genetic makeup, your physical makeup, how you were raised, and so on. Okay, but heredity and environment determines how big that number is with regard to a certain temptation. We are still free. Fred and George are still equally free to put forth to put forth moral effort in response to temptation. It takes George, obviously, a lot more to get the same results as Fred. But at the level of putting forth a moral effort, both Fred and George are perfectly morally free. They're perfectly equal, right? I can give an analogy to exercise, right? This is maybe a familiar one with a lot of people. Maybe you have a sibling who can eat whatever he wants and work out. You walk up the stairs and lose 20 pounds, right? Especially if you have a teenager in your life. You probably have somebody who can lose weight and stay in shape that easily, right? I used to be that guy, right? That karma catches up to those guys around age 30. But anyway, so and say that you have because of your heredity, or environment, it's different. It's harder. It takes you a lot of effort to get yourself to the gym. It takes you a lot of effort to resist fatty foods, it's making up your meals on Sunday night just kills your soul, and it makes you and it's just it comes with all this emotional baggage, right? At the same time, there's a kind of physical, there's literal physical baggage too. I mean, if you're out of shape, you might stick to your diet and your exercise for a few weeks and lose exactly 0 pounds because you just have that metabolism right now, and it's just going to take longer for you to do it, right? So it's frustrating. At any rate, the point is this, that it's not fair, how easily people lose weight or get into shape is not fair, but there is some amount of effort that you could put forth that would get that result. It just takes one person a lot more effort with regard to one temptation than another one, right? And the same thing is true of moral decision making. So the bottom line then is that even though these numbers are unequal and life is not fair, at the level of whether or not Fred and George will put forth the moral effort that it takes to resist the temptation, at that level they are both totally free and totally equal. That's where the freedom exists that the libertarian is talking about, and that the libertarian fights for. Pause for a second. Yeah. Okay, so that is the meat of Campbell's article. Is the idea of moral effort, and it allows his idea of moral effort allows him to do something pretty amazing. It allows him to explain what influence factors like heredity and environment have on our decision making, without admitting that those factors then perfectly determine our decision making, right? Heredity and environment sort of frame how we make decisions. They determine the amount of moral effort it takes to resist certain temptations. But it's still up to us to be willing to put forth the moral effort that it takes to do what we know is the right thing, right? So it's a pretty impressive and dynamic pass at libertarianism. So now it's time we can take some. We can consider some ways that we might object to this. So the first thing we can to analyze this, first thing we might ask is a question that comes up a lot in this discussion. I can hear it for all the way out there from you, rising from the people. The question is, well, what about this? What about those cases where two children are raised in a very abusive home, and one grows up to be a college professor or do something awesome, and one grows up to be, doing life in prison for, murder or rape or something, right? Two people who had very, very similar heredity, had the same environment, and yet one went on to be great and one went on to be, a criminal, right? How does the determinist especially account for this, right? It seems to a lot of people the libertarian has a lot more wiggle room on this. The libertarian can always say, well, that bad kid was just bad from the beginning, right? Which doesn't seem like a terribly libertarian thing to say, but nonetheless, this in particular presents a real problem for determinism, right? If the children raised in we can even make their heredity basically identical. Well, let's say they're twins, right? Identical twins have as close to similar or identical genetics as you can get. Raised in the exact same home by abusive parents, one turns out to be very successful, one turns out to be a criminal, right? How does the determinist account for that? Well, the determinist thinks that what we need to do is we need to look carefully at what the difference was in the lives of those two children, right? The answer is in there somewhere, the determinist is forced to say, and it's a scientific answer. It's an answer about there are lots of differences that might have occurred at some point. One of them, that makes a huge difference is an early childhood head injury, right? That is a hugely determining factor in problems with aggression in later childhood and adulthood, right? And that's just one example off the top of our head. We can talk about other differences. Maybe a parent preferred one child to the other. At any rate, the determinist's answer is going to say, well, I don't know. I can't say to a specific case like that. What I can say is this: there is some reason. I mean, if science is true, then the reason for why one ended up being successful and one ended up being a criminal is in there somewhere. It can't simply be just the universe hiccuped and the kid went to jail, right? Now, from a libertarian perspective on that topic, the libertarians, at least on the face of it, think that they have a leg up to answer this kind of question, because they can say, well, yeah, factors like heredity and environment, they do influence what kind of people we are, but ultimately it is the person's self that truly decides their path of life. And so they are going to, the libertarian, in a lot of cases, is going to place the burden of moral decision making on some indelible self that exists inside of all of us, right? That is the ultimate decider of whether of our actions, right? Now, there's just some preliminary comments to deal with the question, the identical twins questions that come up. But while we're here, this leads pretty well into a discussion that Campbell has when he's toward the end of his article, when he's taking objections, right? He considers an objection that goes like this. He says, well, now what I've proposed is that we're all influenced by heredity and environment, but at some level, it is the self and the self alone inside of all of us that decides to put forth moral effort in a certain situation. And that self then ends up determining the action and being truly morally responsible for whether or not the action occurs, regardless of the other influences of heredity and environment, right? Now, somebody might say, Campbell muses, somebody might say, well, now wait a second, but why does the self put forth moral effort in a certain situation, right? Look at how our intuitions, our moral intuitions, track onto Fred and George as they find their way through their evenings, right? If Fred does the right thing and drives home fine, right, because he should have, we don't think that's particularly wonderful, right? We think, oh, well, he's a responsible guy. If George refuses that third beer and does the right thing and comes home, we say, wow, George, man, he did good. He's got problems. He really did the right thing that night, right? Now, if Fred, on the other hand, drives his car into a school bus at 7 a.m. the next morning and causes a big problem, we say, wow, Fred, you had all the advantages in life and you need to go to jail. You need some time in jail, right? You blew it. If George does that, we say, man, George needs help. George's got problems, right? So we're harsher on people who struggle with a lot of with a lot of temptation and deal with a lot of moral effort. But it's reasonable for a determinist task at this point. But now, wait a second. You're just kicking the ball down the yard a little bit. You're not really answering the real question. The real question to be answered here is, why is moral effort put forth at all? Why does George, in that situation, when he should drink, decide, you know what, not tonight. I'm just gonna put aside that drink, and because I don't want to wreck my car on the way home, right? When all the evidence is going to suggest otherwise, right? And the determinist has the libertarian on the famous double bind here. This is a famous problem in this debate for libertarianism, that the libertarian has to give a reason why somebody's action occurred, right? And they face this dilemma that if they can give a reason why somebody's action occurred, well, it looks like the reason is it determined the action, and they're really just going down the line of determinism, right? If, on the other hand, they say, well, the reason just occurred for no reason at all. It just, the universe hiccuped and he drove home soberly. Well, then it also looks like moral responsibility doesn't apply to actions that are made just at random, right? And that's not what happens. What happens is the libertarian says, well, good actions are made because of good moral character. Like somebody makes a good decision because of good moral character. In these terms, I guess we would say good moral character is a pattern of good habits of avoiding, in this case, alcohol or something like that, right? But the determinist still has to push the libertarian to say, well, but why? Why? At that particular moment, did he decide to do something that should, from an outside position, seem magical, unexplainable, right? And so to this, Campbell says, well, now, wait a second. So obviously, I can't give the determinist the answer that the determinist really wants. The determinist would really want an answer that involves, a brain scan or an fMRI machine, or some tracking of blood in real time through George's brain as he asks a battery of questions related to drinking and alcohol drinking and moral decision making, right? And we're not going to have that, right? If we could have that, maybe maybe the libertarians would have to admit they're wrong. If you can give me a perfect explanation from a brain scan position of why exactly George in that position on that night at that time made that particular decision, maybe we would have to renegotiate our stalemate, right, between determinism and libertarianism. But Campbell's response is, that's not how we do business, we people. Say that you're George's roommate. You know George's story. You've gotten to know him this past week. And you know this party he's going to, and you're a little worried about him that he's going to drink. And he comes home and you find out that he has had a few drinks, but then he stopped, right? And you're amazed. You can't believe it, right? Like, wow, George, I'm impressed. Now, what would you do? Would you break into the neuroscience lab and hook him up to an fMRI machine and have him watch a series of videos about the dangers of alcoholism? No. What would you do? Go ahead and shout it out if you know, my assistant. If you wanted to know why George did the right thing.
You would ask him why.
You would ask him. Good. You just say, George, hey, why didn't you drink tonight? Right? And then he would give you some answer. Right? He would look inside of himself, inside his own reasons, and what he was thinking at the time, and he would give you an answer. Right? And that's the answer, Campbell says. Now, this is not always going to be a satisfying answer, but it's the best we can do. And look how well we do with it. Look how well we make sense of our own behavior and the behavior of others as we navigate our way around the world, assuming that people have free will, that their actions are the results of rational deliberation processes, that they deserve praise and blame for their actions, and so on. We get along with these techniques pretty well. Maybe they're not perfect. Maybe they can be eventually, improved by scientific understanding. But until then, the best shot you got at making sense of why somebody does something surprising is just looking that person in the eye and asking, "Why'd you do that?" Right? And just to be clear, I mean that's not an objective reason in the way that we can, determine all the physical laws that decide that this marker will fall to the table if I let it go, right? We can determine every aspect of that, right? And we can run the experiment with exactly the same results again and again. Now everybody can agree on it. We can all observe it, right? Well, George's reasons for not drinking are like that. Not everybody can observe them. In fact, only one person, George, can directly observe them, and we are kind of at his mercy for describing them, right? But those, Campbell says, those reasons have to do when we're dealing with human beings. I don't like it. I'm always concerned at this point. Every time I come to this point in the Campbell lecture, the Campbell lecture is almost over. By the way, the attendance password is Oprah, right? And it will become clear why. So the story I'm about to tell involves Oprah. So about 10 years ago, when Oprah started her own network called OWN, the Oprah Winfrey Network, there was this reality series on that show where you would go into what they would do is they would have criminals, people who were in jail for serious crimes, and they would have the victims of those criminals, either the actual victims or the family members of the victims. You kill somebody and you're gonna have to face off with the people that you've hurt, right? And they have the final confrontation between them at the end of the show, between the glass over the phones, right? And now let me ruin every episode of this of the show for you, right? So you're familiar with the basic structure of reality television. At first you start out hearing the sad story of the family who's the husband was killed and it changed their lives and tore their family apart, and all because of this this scumbag kid made some bad decision one night at the bodega, right? And then so that's the first 20 minutes, right? And on the next 20 minutes, you go and you hear about the criminal, the kid, and how bad his life has been, and how he ended up robbing the shop and killing that guy and ended up in jail and so on, right? And so then in the final 20 minutes, after the last commercial break, you get the moment of truth, right? You get the moment we've all been waiting for. They're sitting there looking at each other through the glass, both on the phones, and the people who are damaged, they are the victims of crimes. They get to ask the criminal any questions they like. I'll run every episode of the show. All of the victims want to know the answer to one question. Why? And every criminal, you have some version of the same answer. Right? Now, this has it comes out in a lot of different ways. It comes out, some of the criminals have had a lot of counseling. They've had a lot of treatment, for drug and alcohol abuse. They can talk to you about treatment. They can talk to you about this, about lots of different from lots of different sort of therapeutic angles, right? But the real question to the answer why is not something that's going to appear during these conversations, right? Now, this is not to make fun of victims or the criminals. This is only to make a point about Campbell's version of libertarianism. Remember, Campbell thinks that George here. The reason George defied the odds and didn't drive drunk that night was for reasons, but those reasons are only knowable to George. And if we want those reasons, we have to ask George, right? Campbell is going way, way out on a limb here on George's reasons. On George first having real insight into why he did what he did, and secondly, those insights that he has being the real reasons why George did what he did. Because it seems to me with an awful lot of the things that we do, particularly with people with very low insight, like criminals, and people who have a stake in not being honest with themselves about why they do the things they do, and so on. And maybe we don't even have to go that far. Maybe there are just a lot of average people who make decisions, good or bad, and they don't really think about them, and couldn't come up with a real or great reason why if they had to. It kind of looks like Campbell is putting way too much stock in us getting real results from that kind of inward look and coming up with our own reasons. And so I worry about that, about him putting that much stock in that idea. Because if George's reasons for not getting drunk that night aren't the real reasons, then where are the real reasons? They're nowhere. They don't exist. And we're back to that dilemma that they had, that the universe is just sneezing, right? And then George isn't morally responsible for his actions. Then that guy in prison who killed, the shopkeeper isn't responsible for his actions. The universe sneezed, and Dad died. Okay. So that's a pretty heavy note to end on, but it is only going to get heavier from here. We are going to steer right into this question of evil and the existence of evil in the world, and whether evil is a real thing, and why suffering exists, and does the fact that human beings suffer in serious and gratuitous ways, does that mean that that God could not possibly exist? So what we're going to be reading next is we're going to be putting aside free will for a second. Next, we're going to be reading a chapter from Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian writer. So, okay. Thanks a lot. I will talk to you later.